The silence in the courtroom was so total, so absolute, that the only sound I could hear was the frantic, panicked drumming of my own heart. The judge, a man whose face I can't recall but whose eyes I will never forget, looked down from his high bench, his gaze bypassing my parents entirely and landing squarely, heavily on me. The gavel was still clutched in his hand, a wooden scepter that had just passed a sentence far more profound than any financial penalty. Its final, decisive crack still seemed to hang in the air, an echo that had shattered the world my adoptive parents had so carefully constructed. My adoptive mother, Karen, was frozen mid-objection, her perfectly made-up face a grotesque mask of disbelief, her mouth hanging agape. My adoptive father, Richard, who had worn a cloak of smug confidence like a second skin for as long as I could remember, simply stared, his composure finally, irrevocably broken. Then the judge spoke, and the words that filled the dead air didn't just signal the end of a grueling trial. They ripped the veil from the one secret my parents had guarded their entire lives, a secret they intended to take to their graves. It was a truth so fundamental to my very existence that hearing it aloud felt like the ground itself was violently tilting on its axis, throwing everything I thought I knew into a dark, bottomless abyss. To truly comprehend the weight of that secret, and why the judge's words were not an end but a terrifying new beginning, we have to go back to the very first moment I understood that in my world, for me, love was not a right but a privilege to be earned, a prize that was always just out of reach. Before I continue, make sure to subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, comment below, and leave your like. Helps a lot. My name is Aaliyah, and for the first 18 years of my life, my story was a simple one. A narrative polished and presented by my adoptive parents, Richard and Karen. I was the lucky one, the charity case. I was the little girl they had plucked from a tragically vague, bad situation, and gifted a second chance at life. This was the story they told at dinner parties, at community fundraisers, and to every new acquaintance. To the outside world, they were saints, pillars of their affluent community. Impossibly generous, morally upstanding, and refreshingly progressive. They first had their biological son, Ethan, a golden boy 2 years my senior, who was the sun around which their universe revolved. Then they adopted me, a little black girl, in a move that their friends and colleagues lauded as an act of pure, unadulterated selflessness. Our family portrait was the very picture of a perfect modern family. But the reality inside our sprawling, impeccably clean home was governed by invisible walls and unwritten rules that I could feel in my bones but could never point to. Ethan was the heir, the prince, the future they were building. I was the project, the testament to their virtue. Love for Ethan was like the air he breathed, unconditional, effortless, and endlessly available. Love for me was a commodity, a reward for perfect grades, flawless behavior, and quiet gratitude. It had to be earned day by day, and the slightest misstep meant it could be, and often was, snatched away in a heartbeat. The first time I felt the chilling reality of this dynamic, I was 7 years old. I came bursting through the front door, my small hands clutching a piece of paper that felt like the most important document in the world. It was a drawing, a vibrant, swirling explosion of color depicting a field of sunflowers under a Van Gogh-esque starry sky. And it had just won first prize in the school's annual art competition. I was practically vibrating with pride, my heart about to beat out of my chest. I found Karen in the living room, reclining on a pristine white sofa, reading a novel. "Mom, look. I won first prize," I exclaimed, holding the drawing out for her. She glanced at it over the top of her expensive reading glasses, a tight, polite, almost clinical smile touching her lips. "Oh, that's nice, dear," she said, her voice lacking any genuine warmth. "Very colorful. Why don't you go put it on the fridge?" Her attention was already back on her book before I had even turned to leave. Later that same evening, Ethan trudged home, his shoulders slumped, clutching a math test stained with the angry red ink of a C-. He'd completely forgotten to study, distracted by a new video game. I watched from the shadows of the hallway as Richard pulled him aside. I braced myself for the lecture, for the disappointment. Instead, Richard ruffled Ethan's hair and said with a warm chuckle, "Hey, champ. Tough one, huh? We'll get him next time. How about we go over it together after dinner?" There was no lecture, no sigh of disappointment, just immediate, unwavering support. My first place ribbon, which I had pinned so proudly to the refrigerator door, suddenly looked cheap, its colors gaudy and meaningless. My tangible achievement was dismissed as nice. His lazy failure was an opportunity for them to bond. This incident set the pattern for my entire childhood, a constant, soul-crushing rhythm of double standards. When Ethan, in a fit of adolescent energy, kicked a soccer ball through the living room window, it was waved off with a casual, "Boys will be boys." When I, at age 10, accidentally spilled a glass of juice on the dining room rug, I was subjected to a long, humiliating lecture on carelessness and gratitude. "Aaliyah, you need to be more mindful," Karen said, her voice sharp with irritation. "We have given you so much. We've given you this beautiful home. The very least you can do is show some respect for our things." They never had to say the words, "We love him more." They didn't need to. It was woven into the very fabric of our daily lives. Ethan's birthdays were extravagant affairs with bounce houses, catered food, and dozens of laughing friends filling our backyard. My birthdays were quiet, formal family dinners where the main event was me delivering a prepared speech thanking them for their generosity and for allowing me to live there for another year. They actively nurtured every flicker of interest Ethan showed. When he decided he wanted to play hockey, they dropped thousands of dollars on the best gear and committed to driving him to a rink an hour away for practice at 5 in the morning. When I, a few months later, timidly mentioned that I was interested in learning to play the piano, Karen had waved a dismissive hand. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves, Aaliyah. Your schoolwork is far more important. Let's focus on keeping your grades up." So, I learned the art of invisibility. I learned to shrink myself, to take up less space, to mute my own needs and desires until I could barely hear them myself. I learned to be quiet, to be agreeable, to be perpetually grateful. I understood, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that my place in their home wasn't a given. It was a fragile, ongoing transaction. I provided them with a public image of being good, charitable, progressive people, and in return they provided me with food, shelter, and the veneer of a family. The price of my admission, the cost of this transaction, was my silence and my compliance. But beneath that quiet surface, a slow-burning ember of anger began to glow. I was always praised for being the strong one, the one who never complained, the one who never asked for anything, the one who was just so grateful to be there. I was starting to realize that strong one was just their convenient, complimentary way of saying, the one we are allowed to neglect. The teenage years were a minefield. The subtle, corrosive put-downs evolved into a campaign of outright control, and my very identity became the central battleground. As a black girl growing up in a predominantly white, affluent town, I began to feel an intense yearning to connect with my heritage. It was a natural, essential part of my journey to selfhood. I sought out black authors, lost myself in the rhythms of black musicians, and began to dream of wearing my hair in its beautiful, natural state. To Richard and Karen, however, this wasn't self-discovery. It was a hostile act of defiance, a rejection of the carefully curated identity they had tried to impose on me. When I started filling my bookshelf with the powerful words of Maya Angelou, James Baldwin, and Toni Morrison, Karen would pick one up from my nightstand, holding it between her thumb and forefinger as if it were contaminated. "Isn't this a little aggressive?" she'd ask, her lip curling with a faint, polite disgust. "You have to be careful, Aaliyah. You don't want to come across as too political. It could alienate people, you know. Important people." Meanwhile, Ethan was deep in a full-blown punk rock phase. A messy riot of green-spiked hair, ripped clothes held together by safety pins, and angry, distorted music that blasted from his room at all hours. My parents just chuckled and called it self-expression. Richard would clap him on the back and laugh. "He's finding himself. Let the kid live a little." Ethan's rebellion was a charming phase. My attempt to find my own roots was a social and political threat. The most painful battle, the one that left the deepest scars, was over my hair. After a decade of harsh chemical straighteners and painful hot combs designed to make my hair more manageable and acceptable to their standards, I decided I was done. I wanted to embrace the hair I was born with. I spent weeks researching, watching tutorials, and finally, I mustered the courage to do the big chop and start fresh. The first time I came downstairs with my hair in its natural, tightly coiled, glorious state, a proud afro crowning my head, the silence in the house was a physical force. It was deafening. Ethan snickered into his cereal. Karen just stared, her face a horrified cocktail of pity and disgust. "Oh, honey," she said, her voice dripping with the same condescending sweetness she'd use for a sick puppy. "Are you sure about that? It's not very professional, is it? It looks unkempt." Richard, without even bothering to look up from his morning newspaper, delivered the final blow. "Your mother's right. If you want to be taken seriously in life, you have to look the part." Their words were not just insults. They were tiny, sharp razors, methodically slicing away at my budding sense of self. They were explicitly telling me that the way I was naturally born was fundamentally wrong. Unprofessional, unkempt, unacceptable. Ethan could look like a walking disaster zone because his place in their world, and the world at large, was secure. Mine was eternally probationary, and my physical appearance was a critical part of the terms and conditions of my acceptance. When I left for college, the financial leash they had always kept me on became a chokehold. They made a grand, public gesture of agreeing to pay my tuition, a fact they made sure everyone in their social circle knew about. But this generosity was not a gift. It was a finely honed weapon. Every single month, without fail, I was required to submit a detailed line-item budget of all my expenses for their review and approval. If I dared to spend $10 on coffee with a study group, I could expect a call from Karen that evening. "Aaliyah, we were just looking at the credit card statement," she'd begin, her voice laced with disappointment. "Was that coffee outing really necessary? We are making a very significant investment in you. You need to show us that you're taking this opportunity seriously." There was an unspoken threat in every word. "We can take this all away." Meanwhile, Ethan, who was attending the same university, received a brand new sports car for his 21st birthday. When he decided he was tired of dorm life, they didn't just give him a larger allowance for rent. They put a down payment on a luxury condo for him near campus. There were no budgets for Ethan, no lectures on fiscal responsibility. His comfort was a given, an entitlement. My basic needs were line items that had to be rigorously justified and defended. If you're still here with me, don't forget to subscribe, activate notifications, leave your like, and share this video with someone. The final breaking point. The moment all that simmering resentment and quiet pain finally caught fire and erupted, came during the spring of my senior year. My ancient hand-me-down laptop, a relic from Ethan's high school days, finally gave up the ghost. It died completely, right in the middle of my thesis research. My final presentation, the culmination of 4 years of work and worth half my final grade, was just 2 weeks away. I was working a part-time job at the campus library, but my meager savings weren't nearly enough to buy a new computer on such short notice. My stomach was a tangled mess of knots as I dialed their number. I despised asking them for anything, the act itself a reinforcement of my dependency, and my voice trembled as I explained the situation, trying to sound responsible and not desperate. Richard's voice on the other end of the line was as cold and hard as ice. "Aaliyah, this is what we call a real-world lesson in responsibility. You should have planned for this eventuality. Your brother, for example, saves his money for things he needs." The lie was so blatant, so audacious, it took my breath away. Ethan had never saved a dime in his life because he was given everything he ever wanted, instantly and without question. "I have some savings," I pleaded, my voice cracking. "But it's not enough. Richard, my entire thesis is on that drive. It's worth half my grade for the semester. I'm going to fail." There was a long, heavy, theatrical sigh on the other end of the line, the sound of a deeply burdened man being asked for yet another sacrifice. "Fine," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "We will lend you the money. But we expect to be paid back in full, with interest, within 6 months of your graduation. We are not a charity, you know. We're not a charity." Those 4 words hung in the air, sharp, cruel, and impossibly hypocritical. For my entire life, they had paraded me around as their greatest act of charity. But the one time I was truly in crisis, the one time I actually needed help to avoid catastrophic failure, I was suddenly a bad investment, a credit risk. In that moment, something deep inside me shattered. It was the sudden, horrifying, crystal-clear realization that they would be perfectly happy to watch me fail. It would not only prove them right about my supposed irresponsibility, it would perfectly fit their narrative of the troubled girl who just couldn't get her life together, despite everything they had so generously done for her. I didn't take their money. I swallowed my pride, borrowed a laptop from a kind friend, and worked around the clock, fueled by rage and coffee, to finish my thesis. I graduated with honors. I saw them in the crowd at the ceremony, smiling and waving, performing the role of the proudest parents in the world for the assembled audience. But as I walked across that stage to accept my diploma, I finally knew the unvarnished truth. I wasn't their daughter. I was their longest and most successful project. And I was done. After graduation, I packed my life into 2 suitcases and moved 3 states away, putting as much physical distance between us as I possibly could. The distance was a balm, a blessed relief. I reduced our contact to the barest minimum. Brief, excruciatingly polite calls on birthdays and holidays. They didn't seem to miss me. In fact, they seemed relieved. Out of sight, out of mind. The project was complete. But the gnawing questions from my childhood never went away. The more I built my own life, the more I looked back and the less sense any of it made. Their deliberately vague stories about my troubled past, their obsessive focus on the financial cost of raising me, the constant, suffocating reminders of their great sacrifice. It all felt wrong. One memory in particular always stuck out, a nagging splinter in my mind. The old, dilapidated shed in their backyard. Richard kept it locked up tighter than a bank vault. Ethan was occasionally allowed inside to retrieve tools or lawn equipment, but I was strictly, unequivocally forbidden from ever going near it. "It's not a place for you, Aaliyah," Karen would say with a tight-lipped finality. "There are dangerous things in there. It's for your own safety." A year after I moved away, I received the call I had been simultaneously dreading and, in a strange, dark way, waiting for. My grandmother, Karen's mother, had passed away. I knew I had to go back for the funeral. I dreaded the thought of seeing them, of having to slip back into the suffocating role of the grateful daughter. But a small, determined part of me saw an opening, a sliver of a chance to find an answer. The day after the funeral, the house was mercifully empty. Richard, Karen, and Ethan had gone out to run errands related to the estate. My heart pounded a frantic rhythm against my ribs. This was it. This was my only chance. My hands trembling, I walked to the junk drawer in the kitchen where Richard kept his spare keys. My fingers closed around a small, rusted, old-fashioned key I'd seen 100 times but never touched. I slipped it into my pocket and, with a deep breath, walked out to the backyard. The lock on the shed was old and stiff, but the key turned. The door creaked open with a groan, releasing a musty, cloying smell of damp earth and rust. At first glance, it was just a normal shed. Shelves cluttered with old tools, half-empty cans of chemicals, and general junk. But my eyes scanned the space, searching. Tucked away under a dusty, grimy tarp in the back corner was something else. A heavy-duty, military-style metal footlocker. It, too, was locked with a heavy padlock. This was it. A surge of pure adrenaline shot through me, silencing my fear. I frantically searched the cluttered shed until my hands found a crowbar. For a fleeting second I hesitated. This was a line. A boundary I could never, ever uncross. But then I heard Richard's voice, cold and dismissive, echoing in my head. "We're not a charity." I jammed the tip of the crowbar into the lock's hasp and pried with all my strength. With a loud, violent, satisfying screech of protesting metal, it broke. I lifted the heavy lid, my muscles straining. Inside were not dangerous tools or rusty equipment. It was my life. My entire life, packed away and hidden in a cold, dark metal box. On the very top was a thick, official-looking binder with a crisp label on the spine. Aaliyah. Adoption file. My breath hitched in my throat. Opened it. There were things I expected to see. Baby photos I'd never been shown, copies of legal documents, my original birth certificate with a name I didn't recognize. But tucked inside a clear plastic sleeve near the front was something else entirely. It was a multi-page psychological evaluation, purportedly conducted when I was just 6 months old. It was filled with dense, clinical jargon, diagnosing me with oppositional defiant disorder with early signs of attachment-related pathology. The report concluded by recommending a specialized, high-cost, long-term therapeutic care plan. I knew, with an instinct that transcended logic, that it was a lie. I had vague memories of my childhood pediatrician, a kind man who had always given me a lollipop. My own medical records, which I'd obtained years ago, showed a perfectly healthy, normal baby. This document was a forgery. Had to be. Beneath the binder were stacks of old financial ledgers. I flipped through them, my hands shaking. I found the records of the standard adoption fees they had paid. But then I found a separate ledger, for a separate hidden bank account. And in it were meticulously recorded deposits. Every single state subsidy check they had received for my care. That fraudulent special needs diagnosis had qualified them for an enhanced government assistance program. They were getting paid a substantial amount of money by the state, every single month, for my entire childhood. Money that was specifically earmarked for my specialized care. The same money they were hoarding in a secret account while lecturing me about the cost of a $10 coffee. But the most gut-wrenching, soul-destroying discovery was at the very bottom of the trunk. It was a series of bank statements showing large, recurring wire payments labeled consulting fees. These payments were made to one individual consistently, for the first 5 years of my life. And lying right next to the statements was a small, faded photograph of a young woman with tired eyes, holding a newborn baby. The baby was me. And the woman, she had my eyes. It was my biological mother. They weren't just hoarding state funds they had fraudulently obtained. They had been paying my biological mother. But for what? Her silence. The pieces of the puzzle began to click into place, forming a picture so ugly, so monstrous and devastating, that I could barely breathe. My adoption wasn't an act of charity. It was a business transaction. Cold, calculated, profitable deal. And I was the asset. I took the entire box. I didn't stop to think. I walked out of that shed, got into my rental car and drove. I didn't say goodbye. What was there to say? The entire 20-year relationship was a carefully constructed lie. And now, finally, I had the proof. The long drive back to my apartment was a blur of white-hot rage and gut-wrenching sobs. The people who were supposed to love and protect me had bought me, profited off me, and deliberately starved me of affection, all while wearing a public mask of saintly goodness. The girl who was always told she was lucky was, in fact, the victim of a long, cold, meticulously calculated fraud. The very next day I found a lawyer. A formidable, no-nonsense powerhouse of a woman named Ms. Davies who specialized in adoption fraud. I sat in her sleek, intimidating office and laid out the contents of the footlocker across her large mahogany desk. The fake diagnosis, the hidden ledgers, the payment records, the photograph. Ms. Davies examined each document with a forensic intensity, her expression growing colder and harder with every page she turned. "This is more than just emotional abuse, Aaliyah," she said finally, her voice firm and resolute. "This is a clear, egregious case of civil fraud. They defrauded the state government by claiming subsidies for special needs you do not have, and in doing so, they fundamentally defrauded you of the care, support, and childhood you were legally and morally entitled to. They used you as a cash cow while systematically making you feel like an insufferable burden. The payments to my biological mother were the linchpin. Ms. Davies suspected it was something far more sinister than just hush money. Real, deep-level adoption fraud often starts at the source," she explained, her eyes fixed on mine. She theorized that my biological mother and the director of the now-defunct adoption agency were in on the scheme from the very beginning. The thought of facing Richard and Karen in a court of law was terrifying. They had spent my entire life convincing me that I was small, that my voice didn't matter. But holding the cold, hard evidence in my hands, with the unshakable force of Ms. Davies beside me, I felt something inside me shift. Spark of defiance. This was never about the money. It was about reclaiming the truth. It was about standing up finally and declaring, "You do not get to write my story anymore." "Let's do it," I said, my voice clearer and stronger than it had felt in my entire life. The legal battle that followed was brutal, just as Ms. Davies had warned. Richard and Karen's expensive legal team tried to paint me as an unstable, vindictive, and ungrateful woman attempting to extort money from the two loving parents who had saved her from a terrible fate. They claimed the diagnosis was real, that I had indeed been a very difficult child, and that their firm but loving care had miraculously cured me of my pathologies. That secret bank account. It was a college fund they were diligently saving for me, a surprise they were waiting to reveal. The payments to my biological mother. Those were just charitable gifts to help a poor, struggling woman in need. Their ability to gaslight, to twist reality, was a masterclass in manipulation. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't just armed with my feelings. I had the documents. I had the truth. When I walked into the courtroom on the first day of the trial, a strange and unexpected calm washed over me. Richard and Karen were already seated at the defendant's table, looking at me with cold, hard, reptilian eyes. The loving, benevolent parents I had spent a lifetime trying so desperately to please were gone. In their place sat the strangers they had always truly been. The only difference was that now I was seeing them clearly for the very first time. On the witness stand I told my story. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I just spoke the truth calmly and methodically. I told the jury about the first prize drawing and the C- math test. I told them about my hair, and about being called unprofessional and unkempt for simply daring to exist as I was. I told them about the laptop and the soul-crushing cruelty of Richard's words. "We're not a charity." I laid out the collection of 1,000 tiny cuts, each one designed to make me feel small, worthless, and eternally indebted. Then Ms. Davies presented the evidence from the shed. She projected the fraudulent diagnosis onto a large screen for the jury to see. She walked them through the hidden ledgers page by page. The jurors' faces grew grim, then stony as they saw the numbers, the sheer scale and duration of the deception. The cross-examination was as vicious as I had feared. Their lawyer, a slick man with a cruel smirk, tried to make me sound hysterical and unreliable. "Isn't it true, Ms. Miller, that you were known to be a moody and withdrawn teenager?" he sneered. I was a teenager who was being systematically told that the natural texture of my hair was a problem that needed to be fixed, I replied calmly, looking directly at the jury. "Isn't it true," he pressed on, "that your parents, the defendants, paid for your entire college education? A gesture of incredible generosity." "It is true they paid for it," I said, my voice steady. "And it is also true that they held it over my head like a weapon to control me, all while they were secretly profiting from my very existence." The hardest part was watching Richard and Karen testify. They were so polished, so convincing. Karen wept on the stand, clutching a handkerchief and talking about how much she loved me, how this was all a terrible misunderstanding. Richard was the picture of stoic, wounded fatherhood, portraying himself as a good man utterly betrayed by the child he had given everything to. But Ms. Davies dismantled their performance, piece by painful piece. She pulled up the bank records for the secret account on the courtroom screen. "If this was, as you claim, a college fund for Aaliyah," she asked Richard, her voice like steel, "why was she never told about it? More importantly, why did you attempt to lend her money for a laptop, at interest, when this account, meant for her welfare, contained over $200,000? Richard stammered. He blanched. He had no answer. The performance was over. The mask had shattered. And that brings us back to that final, deafening moment in the courtroom. The jury had deliberated for less than 2 hours. They found Richard and Karen liable for civil fraud and intentional infliction of emotional distress, awarding me every single dollar they had taken from the state, plus significant punitive damages. Karen let out a choked, animalistic sob. Richard's face was ghost white, a mask of pure shock. Their lawyer shot to his feet to begin a sputtering objection, but the judge silenced him with a single sharp raise of his hand. And that's when he looked at me, truly looked at me. "This court has made its ruling on the civil matter before it," the judge said, his voice resonating with a deep, solemn authority that filled the room. "However, the evidence presented in this trial points to a deception so profound, so morally bankrupt, that it cannot be adequately addressed by financial restitution alone." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "The evidence shows that the special needs designation was not a mistake, but was maliciously fabricated at the very source. It was initiated by the plaintiff's biological mother, in collusion with the director of the now-defunct Westbrook Adoption Agency, in exchange for a substantial under-the-table payment from the defendants." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. I felt the floor drop out from under me. My biological mother. It wasn't just hush money. She wasn't a victim they were exploiting. She was the architect. She was the one who had put the price tag on me. The judge's gaze, now like granite, locked onto Richard and Karen. The defendants then knowingly and enthusiastically capitalized on this fraudulent foundation for 2 decades. They were not merely passive participants. They were willing, active, and cruel beneficiaries of a lie that began before they even met this child. He then turned his gaze back to me, and for the first time, his expression softened with something that looked like compassion. "The law can provide restitution," he said gently, "but it cannot heal a wound this deep. That journey, Ms. Miller, is now yours, and yours alone to begin." Then he looked back at my adoptive parents, his face a mask of stone-cold contempt. The gavel came down with a deafening, final crack. "This court is adjourned." The secret was out. My entire life had not just been a lie, but a lie built upon an even uglier, more fundamental lie. I wasn't saved from a bad situation. I was sold into one. My adoptive parents were monsters, yes, but my story didn't start with them. It started with the original sin of a mother selling her own child for parts. In the months that followed, I learned that the district attorney's office, prompted by the judge's findings, had filed criminal fraud charges against Richard and Karen. The authorities had also successfully tracked down the former agency director and my biological mother. They were all facing their own legal and moral reckoning. But for me, the real victory wasn't found in a courtroom or in their punishment. It was in finally, absolutely knowing the truth. Learning about my biological mother's role was a second, deeper, and more complex heartbreak, but in that devastating knowledge, I found a strange and unexpected kind of freedom. That desperate, lifelong need for their approval, the constant nagging feeling of not being good enough, the weight of their disappointment, it all just dissolved. The question was never about me. It was never about my worthiness or my behavior or the texture of my hair. It was always only about their greed, their cruelty, and their unending cascade of lies. The day I finally stopped carrying the crushing weight of their expectations was the day I realized I had forgiven them. Not for their sake, they are beyond that, but for mine. Forgiveness wasn't about letting them off the hook or absolving them of their sins. It was about releasing myself from the prison of their narrative. I am not the lucky one. I am not the charity case. I am not the broken thing they tried so hard to make me believe I was. I am Aaliyah. And for the very first time in my life, my story is finally and completely my own. Thank you for listening to my story. Please subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, comment below, leave your like, and share this video with others.